Welcome to A Wonderful Story, friends. In this episode, I will tell you the story of the human pilot Henry and the alien queen Elena. If you're ready, let's begin. Enjoy the show. I thought I had only saved the alien queen, but I had saved the child in her womb as well. There is a particular kind of silence that happens right before everything goes wrong, and Henry had learned, over 11 years of flying things he probably shouldn't have been trusted with, to recognize it. It was the silence he heard now, 300 meters above the crater fields of Denar, in the half-second after the royal transport ahead of him stopped being a sleek arc of Elari crystalwork and became, instead, a very expensive fireball. "Oh, come on," Henry said to no one, because there was no one. His cargo skiff, the Marigold, named after an ex-girlfriend who had also, in the end, exploded without warning, carried exactly one passenger, and that passenger was talking to himself. "I was told this was a boring run. Somebody wrote boring on the manifest. I read it." The transport spun, trailing fire and molten filigree, and Henry did the thing his instructors had spent years trying to train out of him, which was to fly toward the disaster instead of away from it. This was, they had explained, statistically a great way to die. Henry had always found statistics a little judgmental. Below, the wreck plowed into the rust-colored regolith and skidded, throwing up a plume of dust the color of old blood. Denar had been a battlefield twice in Henry's lifetime, and it wore its scars badly. Pock-marked flats, glassy blast craters, the occasional half-buried hull of something that used to be a warship and was now just weather. Not the sort of place you wanted to make an unscheduled landing. Not the sort of place you wanted to do anything, really, except leave. He brought the Marigold down hard enough to rattle his teeth and loose enough that landed was generous. Before the dust had settled, he was out, boots crunching over ground that steamed where the fire touched it, and he was already talking again, which was what he did when he was afraid. "Hello? Anybody in there who'd like to not be on fire? Free of charge? Limited time offer?" He found her through the buckled seam of the hull, and for one absurd second his brain simply refused. Because you did not, on a Tuesday, on a boring run, reach into a burning royal transport and find the queen of the Elari looking back at you. She was unmistakable. He'd seen her face on 100 banners after the armistice, the pale, luminous skin the Elari nobility prized, the long swept-back ears that marked her people, the crown of woven light that had, at some point in the crash, gone dark. Now the face was streaked with soot and blood, and one of those famous ears had a very unqueenly gash across it, and she was pinned under a beam that Henry, who was not a large man, regarded with the deep personal offense of someone being asked to lift furniture. "Your Majesty," he said, because it seemed rude not to. "I'm going to be honest with you. This is above my pay grade in several ways." Her eyes found him. They were sharp, even now, even half-dazed. "You are a human," she managed. "Guilty." "You are," she coughed. "You are talking a great deal. It's a nervous condition, hold still." He wedged his shoulder under the beam and heaved, and something in his back made a sound he chose to ignore, and the beam shifted maybe a hand's width. Enough. He got an arm around her, and she was heavier than she looked and lighter than she should have been, and she gripped his sleeve with a strength that surprised him as he dragged her out through the ruined seam. "There is," she gasped. "There is a proper way to address the crown." "Absolutely," Henry said, hauling her across the steaming ground while behind them the transport made the low, thoughtful groan of a machine deciding to detonate. "You can send me the etiquette manual later, preferably from somewhere that isn't here." The Marigold's ramp was down. He got her up it, half carrying, half arguing, and had cleared perhaps 40 meters of sky when the transport finally made good on its promise. The blast slapped the little skiff sideways. Henry swore, corrected, and leveled out with the queen slumped against the bulkhead behind his chair, her breathing shallow, her eyes drifting closed. Hey, Majesty, stay with me. Say something regal." "Your ship," she murmured, "smells of fuel and poor decisions." That's the spirit. The healers were waiting at the crystal spires by the time he limped the Marigold down, a blur of pale robes and glowing instruments and people who very clearly did not want a soot-covered human touching their queen for 1 second longer than necessary. They took her from him in a rush of light and urgency, and someone pressed a thermal blanket into his hands, and someone else recited a formal thank you that had obviously been written for a much grander rescuer than a courier pilot with a bad back. And then, quite suddenly, it was over. He stood on the landing platform as the marigold ticked and cooled behind him, the blanket around his shoulders, watching the doors of the healer's hall swallow the small, pale procession. Nobody asked him to follow. Why would they? He'd done the thing. The thing was done. Henry let out a long breath and felt the fear drain out of him, leaving behind the flat, buzzing quiet of an ordinary afternoon that had briefly forgotten to be ordinary. "Well," he said to the empty platform, "he saved a queen. That was a good one. That was a story for the bar, for the mechanic, for the next slow night when someone doubted the marigold could do anything but haul crates. He'd tell it well. He'd leave out the part where he cried a little on the way home. He climbed back into his ship, pointed her at the ordinary sky, and told himself, with the total sincerity of a man who has no idea what's coming, that his part in her story had just ended. The trouble with saving a queen, Henry discovered, was that it did absolutely nothing for the state of your landing gear. 3 weeks after Denar, he was flat on his back under the marigold in the sagging hangar he rented on the edge of Port Kessel, elbow deep in a hydraulic coupling that had been leaking since before the war, arguing with a Torco wrench. Life had resumed its usual shape, which was to say it involved a great deal of grease and no royalty whatsoever. He found this deeply reassuring. He told himself so, several times a day, which was possibly a sign that he did not entirely believe it. "You're doing the face again," said Mila from somewhere near his boots. Mila was his mechanic, his landlord, and his only friend within 100 light years who didn't owe him money, though she made up for it by owing him nothing and reminding him constantly. She was crouched at the toolbox with the particular stillness of a woman waiting to be told something interesting. "I don't have a face," Henry said. "I have several. Which one?" "The one where you almost died and won't shut up about not talking about it." She handed him a sealant cartridge before he asked, which was the closest she came to affection. "You pulled a lady out of a crash. It was very brave. You've mentioned it 4 times. Twice. 4, I counted. I was going to make a chart." She peered under the ship at him. "You just didn't mention it was the Queen." Henry's hand slipped and the sealant went everywhere. "Where'd you hear that?" "Everywhere, eventually. You're a terrible secret keeper, Henry. You narrate your own life. 'Boring run,' you said, and then you came home looking like you'd been chewed by a star and you tipped me 40%, which you have never once done. So either you found religion or you did something enormous and stupid." She grinned. "It was enormous and stupid, wasn't it?" "It was medium and stupid." He slid out from under the ship, wiped his hands on a rag that made them dirtier, and let himself for a moment remember the weight of her against his shoulder, the impossible pale face, the ear with the gash. He'd thought about it more than he'd admit to Mila, which was why he hadn't admitted it to Mila. She was fine. Healers took her. That's the whole story. I got a blanket. "You got a blanket," Mila repeated, flatly, as though this confirmed something tragic about the universe. "A very nice blanket." That would have been the end of it, and Henry would have gone happily to his grave 40 years later, still calling it a boring run, if the summons hadn't arrived that afternoon. It came the way important things always came to unimportant people, with far too much ceremony and no consideration for whether he was busy. A courier drone the size of a fist and the color of pearl descended into the hangar, hovered with insulting precision, and unfolded a slip of crystal that projected the seal of the Elari crown in the air above his workbench. Mila dropped a socket. The drone waited, radiating patience, for Henry to stop staring. The message was short. He was requested. The word was requested, though the gold-threaded formality made it feel a great deal more like required, to present himself at the Crystal Court within 3 days, at the express wish of Her Majesty, the Queen Elena. "Okay," Henry said, in the small voice of a man watching his quiet life pack a bag. "Okay, that's fine. That's normal. People get summoned." "You are being summoned by a queen," Mila said, delighted and appalled in equal measure. "Do you own clothes?" He did not, it turned out, own clothes suitable for a crystal court, and the coat he borrowed from a wealthier acquaintance was cut for a man with broader shoulders and a shorter torso, so that Henry arrived at the great spires 3 days later looking like a boy wearing his father's authority. He spent the shuttle ride rehearsing dignified silence and the walk through the halls losing his nerve about it. The court was worse than the banners had promised. Vaulting arches of grown crystal that caught the light and threw it back in slow rivers of color. Floors so clear he kept flinching at the drop that wasn't there. Everything humming faintly with the resonance the Elari built into their architecture, like the whole palace was quietly singing to itself. He was braced for a lot of things. A medal, maybe. A bill, more likely. He had, after all, left a scorch mark on a royal landing platform. Worst case, some noble telling him in 40 polite words to never speak of the Queen again. What he was not braced for was the stillness. They brought him into a smaller hall, high and quiet. And there she was, standing, whole, the gash on her ear healed to a thin silver line, the pale skin luminous the way it had been under all that soot, recovered, regal, utterly unlike the woman who had complained about the smell of his ship. And she looked at him with none of the formal gratitude he'd steeled himself for, none of the ruler's practiced warmth. She looked at him with a quiet so total, it made the singing walls seem loud, one hand resting. He noticed it without understanding it, lightly, protectively, at her belly. "Pilot Henry," Queen Elena said. Her voice was careful, as though the words themselves might break something. "I owe you a great deal more than you know. Please, sit. There is something I must tell you." He sat, mostly because his legs had stopped consulting him. The chair was crystal, too, grown into a shape that had no business being comfortable and somehow was, and Henry perched on the edge of it in his ill-fitting coat and waited for the Queen to explain what a man could possibly owe more than a life he'd already been thanked for. She did not sit. She crossed to a tall window instead, where the light broke over her and turned the silver line on her ear to a thread of fire, and for a while she simply looked out at the spires as if deciding how to begin. "When you pulled me from the wreck," she said at last, "the healers who received me were frightened. Not for the wound to my head, though it was serious. For something they could not at first confirm." She turned, and that hand was at her belly again, and this time Henry's eyes followed it, and this time, God help him, his slow courier brain caught up. "I was carrying a child, Henry. I am carrying a child. The last heir of my line. When you dragged me out of the fire, you did not save one life. You saved two." The singing walls hummed. Somewhere far off a bell of grown crystal chimed the hour. Henry, who had a remark for every occasion, who narrated his own life, who had once told a border officer a 40-minute joke to avoid a search, opened his mouth and produced nothing at all. "I have rehearsed 100 graceful ways to say this," Elena went on, and the smallest dry note entered her voice, the ghost of the woman under the soot. "None of them survived contact with your face. You look as though I have handed you a live grenade and asked you to hold it. That's—" His throat worked. "That's fairly close to how it feels, Majesty, if I'm honest." "You are usually honest. It is your least diplomatic quality." She came away from the window then and did sit opposite him, and up close the composure cost her something. He could see it in the set of her jaw. "My husband died in the last year of the war. My court is half of what it was. I have buried a great deal, Pilot Henry, and I had made my peace with burying the future of my family as well, until a human in a ship that smells of poor decisions decided that statistics were, in his words, judgmental." A pause. "The guard recorded what you said. I have watched it 4 times. That's— everyone keeps counting to 4 about me. It is a resonant number." Almost, she smiled. Then the weight came back down over the room like a tide. "You understand now why a blanket and a written thank you are an insult. You are the reason my line continues. There is no coin in any treasury that matches that. I do not know how to be in debt of this size. I was raised to owe nothing to anyone, and now I owe everything to a stranger who tips his mechanic 40%. You heard about that too? I make it my business to know who I owe." So Henry stayed. He was not precisely asked whether he would. It was arranged around him with the gentle, unstoppable momentum of royal machinery, and by the time he understood the shape of it, he had a set of rooms in a quiet wing, a wardrobe of clothes cut for his actual shoulders, and a reason wrapped in silk. The reason, Elena told him plainly on the second day, was that the faction who had shot her transport out of the sky had wanted the heir dead, and they did not yet know they had failed. And when they learned it, the human who had spoiled their ambush would be worth killing too. Better he stayed inside the crystal walls, where the resonance itself would sing a warning if anything came for him. Henry pointed out that this made him a prisoner. Elena pointed out that it was a very nice prison. Henry conceded the point. He was terrible at palace life. He offended protocol so reliably that the chief steward began flinching when he entered a room. He called a hereditary duke chief and a sacred resonance garden the humming shrubs. He got hopelessly lost and befriended the guards who found him, and the kitchen staff, who liked that he ate everything and complimented all of it, and once fixed their broken chill unit with a torque wrench he was not supposed to have. He became, without meaning to, a small, warm disturbance in a cold and grieving house, and the house, without admitting it, softened around him. And he became, this was the part he could not explain to Mila in the messages he sent home, the Queen's companion in the hours royalty made unbearable. Elena did not sleep well. Neither did he, in a bed that sang. They fell into meeting in a small gallery where the walls were quietest, and they talked, and the talk stopped being the careful fencing of ruler and rescuer and became something plainer. She told him what the crown had cost her, the choices no one thanks you for. He made her laugh at things she had not laughed at in a year and watched her be surprised by it every time. He stopped counting the days until he could leave. He noticed he had stopped and told no one. It was Mila's reply to one of his messages that named the thing he wouldn't. "You're describing her a lot," she wrote, "for a woman who's just a debt." He deleted it without answering, which was its own kind of answer. Then, on a night the walls should have been silent, they weren't. A wrong note threaded through the resonance. Small, deliberate, human-made. Sabotage. Inside the crystal court. And Henry, lying awake in his singing bed, understood that the danger he'd been walled away from had been living inside the walls all along. He was out of bed and following the wrong note before he'd decided to, which was, he reflected later, exactly the flaw that had gotten him into all of this. The resonance was the palace's nervous system. The Elari built it to carry warnings the way nerves carry pain, and Henry had lived inside its humming long enough to feel when it went sour. It was sour now, a thin, discordant thread woven through the singing walls, moving. He tracked it barefoot down a gallery, and it was Elena's guard captain, a broad, quiet man named Owen who had taught Henry to lose at their card game, who intercepted him at the corner with a blade already drawn, and lowered it only when he saw the face. "You feel it too," Owen murmured. "I feel that somebody's put a bad string in the orchestra," Henry whispered back. "That's the Queen's wing. They found the source in a service junction, a resonance lattice, one of the humming crystal nodes that fed the walls, and clamped to it a device no bigger than a fist, patient and wrong, singing its false note into the palace's blood. Owen's people got the Queen moved and the wing sealed, and a court artificer pried the thing loose with the delicate horror of a surgeon removing something that shouldn't be inside a patient. It was a lure, she said, a tuning device, meant to teach the resonance to ignore a specific intruder signature, to make one particular set of footsteps sing as safe. Someone had been rehearsing a way in. "For what night?" Elena asked, when they brought her the ruined device, and no one had to answer because the answer was on the calendar. The rite of continuance was in 2 days, an old public ceremony where the crown showed itself to the court and the people, unbroken, enduring. She had planned to appear. She had planned to let the war-weary Elari see their queen whole and standing. It was, Henry realized with a cold drop in his stomach, the one day she'd be exactly where anyone hunting her could find her. "Cancel it," he said. "I cannot." She said it gently, the way you correct someone you've decided to keep. A queen who hides is a queen who is losing. If I do not stand, the factions have already won, and every noble who wonders whether the line is worth defending will have their answer. She looked at the shattered lure in the artificer's hands. "They will come at the right, so we will be ready at the right." "We," said Henry. "You are extremely difficult to leave out of things," Elena said. "I have tried." So he stood among the court on the day of continuance in a formal coat that finally fit, which felt like a betrayal, watching the great resonance hall fill with pale nobles and the woven light crown catch the sun. Elena rose to speak, luminous and unbothered, and Henry, who had spent 2 days with Owen learning where the sightlines were and where a man might stand who wanted to matter, watched the crowd instead of the queen, because someone had to, and because he could not have watched her and stayed calm. He saw it a half-second before the resonance did. A steward, one of the flinching functionaries he'd offended a dozen times, whose footsteps sang safe as he crossed the floor toward the dais, whose hand went into his robe with the wrong kind of purpose, the false note, the rehearsed path. Henry did not have a plan. Henry had never once in his life had a plan. What he had was proximity and a torque wrench he was still not supposed to be carrying. And he moved. It was not graceful. History would not record it as graceful. He crossed 6 meters of sacred floor at a dead sprint, shouted, "Chief, no," which was possibly the least regal warning ever uttered in that hall, and hit the steward like a cargo skiff making a loose landing. The thing in the man's hand, a resonance charge keyed to shatter crystal and everyone standing near it, skidded across the clear floor and spun. And Elena, who was not a woman who waited to be saved twice, was already moving too. She brought her heel down on the device with a queen's whole cold fury and the crack of grown crystal, and the false note died mid-song, and the charge went dark and dead beneath her foot. The steward, pinned and shouting names that would end several noble houses by morning, was hauled away by Owen's guards. The hall erupted. Henry lay on the floor of the most sacred room in the Elari world, out of breath, aching in the back that had never forgiven Denar, and started helplessly to laugh. Elena knelt beside him in front of the entire court, which no queen had done in living memory, and the noise of the hall seemed to fall away. "You said, 'Chief,'" she said, "to an assassin." I panicked. It's my whole method. He looked up at her, at the pale face and the silver line on her ear and the thing in her eyes that was not gratitude and had stopped pretending to be. "Elena, when I said statistics were judgmental, I didn't actually mean I wanted to keep testing them. I know what you meant." Her hand found his, there on the floor, in front of everyone, and neither of them let go. "Henry, Your Majesty," said the chief steward, arriving with catastrophic timing and a face like a struck bell. "The traitor has names. We must convene at once." Elena closed her eyes briefly, the way a woman does when the universe has proven it is watching and petty. "Of course he does," she said. She stood, drawing Henry up by the hand she still held, and only let go at the last moment, and the letting go felt like the loudest thing in the room. The conspiracy had a face now, and a list. But the list, Owen warned them low as the court emptied, ran up into houses too powerful to simply arrest, and the only lawful way to break them would ask of Elena a choice that could cost her the one person she had never planned to want. The names the steward gave ran, as Owen had feared, straight into the marrow of the old aristocracy. 3 houses that had wanted the war to end differently, that had reasoned, in the cold arithmetic of the powerful, that a dead heir and an empty throne would be easier to divide than a living queen who kept insisting on peace. They could not simply be arrested. They had votes in the High Assembly and blood in half the court, and any queen who moved against them without ironclad law would look like a tyrant purging rivals under the cover of a fright. There was a lawful way. Elena laid it out for Henry in the small, quiet gallery, in the gray hour before the assembly convened, and he watched her hate every word of it. Elari law had an old provision, a reckoning they called it, in which a monarch could compel the accused houses to answer under the resonance itself, a public interrogation before the full assembly, where the crystal sang truth from lie so plainly that no noble could hide behind rank. It was binding. It was absolute. And it required the monarch to stake her own standing on the outcome. If the reckoning failed to prove the treason, if the resonance found the queen had accused falsely, the crown passed to the assembly to reassign. She would be staking the throne, the heir's protection, everything, on the truth holding up in front of the very people who wanted it to fall. "And there's a catch," Henry said, because there was always a catch, and because she hadn't looked at him yet. "There is a catch." Now she looked at him. "The provision requires a witness of the crime who is not of the court and owes the crown no fealty, an outsider, untainted by house or oath, so that the resonance cannot be argued to have bent to loyalty." A breath. "There is exactly one person in the Crystal Court who is not Elari, holds no title and swore no oath to me." "Ah," said Henry. "You would stand in the resonance, Henry. It reads the body that speaks through it. It is not gentle. It has, on rare occasions, killed the witness whose account it found too tangled to sing cleanly, not from malice, but because a human heart under that pressure is not built for it. And no human has ever stood in an Elari reckoning at all." She said it steadily, and only her hands betrayed her. "I will not order it. I have spent my whole reign ordering people toward danger and calling it duty. I would rather lose the throne than command you into that room. So I am asking, which I am very bad at, and I am asking you to say no." He thought about the marigold, and the quiet life, and the boring run somebody had written on the manifest. He thought about how he'd stopped counting the days. He thought that a man could spend his whole existence being medium and stupid, or he could, once, be enormous and stupid on purpose. "You're a terrible negotiator," Henry said. "You just told me it might kill me and then told me to say no. That's not how you sell a thing." He took her hands, both of them, the way she'd taken his on the floor of the sacred hall. "I'm not going to say no, Elena. I've read the manifest. It said boring. It's been wrong every single day." The reckoning convened at midday under the great dome. The full assembly ranked in tiers of pale watching faces. The three accused houses seated in their finery with the confidence of people who had never once faced a consequence. Elena stood the throne on the truth. And Henry, human, oathless, in the coat that fit, walked alone into the resonance ring at the dome's heart, where the crystal of the entire palace focused to a single singing point, and felt it take hold of him. It was like being read aloud. Every guard on it, every joke he'd ever hidden behind, peeled away. The resonance reached into the memory of Denar and the burning transport, and the lure clamped to the lattice and the steward crossing the sacred floor, and it pulled the truth of it up through his chest and made the whole dome hear it in a chord so pure it hurt. It found the tangle in him, the fear, the love he hadn't named, the human heart not built for this. And for a long, terrible moment the note went ragged and his knees went, and he heard Elena's voice cry out somewhere beyond the light, and the chord frayed toward the dissonance that killed. And then he did the only thing he knew how to do under pressure, which was to stop hiding. He let it have all of it, even the part where he loved her, especially that, and the tangle came loose, and the resonance found the truth clean at last and sang it, and the whole dome rang with the undeniable, unbearable fact of the treason and the men who had ordered it. The three houses were finished in the space of a single held breath. The assembly, hearing the crime in a chord no noble could dispute, turned as one. Guards moved. It was over. Henry came out of the resonance ring on his feet, barely, grayed at the edges, his ears ringing with a note he'd hear for the rest of his life. And Elena crossed the sacred floor at something a queen was absolutely not supposed to do, and caught him before he fell. "You held," she breathed, gripping his face in both hands, checking he was real. "You impossible human, you held." "Told you," he rasped, grinning through the gray. Manifest was wrong. The conspiracy was broken. The air was safe. The war's last shadow lifted off the crystal court like a fever breaking, and in the ringing quiet, holding each other up in front of an assembly that no longer mattered, they were left at last with the one question no law and no rescue could answer for them. Peace, it turned out, was even worse for the landing gear than war, because now there was no excuse to leave. The Crystal Court in the weeks after the reckoning became a place Henry no longer recognized, not because it changed, but because it stopped bracing. The three fallen houses were unwound by lawful hands. Their lands went to the war's widows, and their votes to an assembly that suddenly remembered how to agree on things. The chief steward, who had spent a season flinching whenever Henry entered a room, unbent so far as to admit, one afternoon, that calling the residence garden the humming shrubs had grown on him. Owen taught Henry a new card game and lost at it on purpose, which Henry noticed and pretended not to. The kitchen staff put his torque wrench repair of their chill unit into the official household record, listed under miscellaneous acts of a foreign national, which Henry considered the finest honor of his life until a better one came along. He kept meaning to leave. He said so to Mila over the long-range link, and Mila, who had flown out to Port Elari on the excuse of servicing the Marigold and stayed 3 weeks eating palace food and calling Dukes chief in open homage, laughed at him until she had to sit down. "You're not going home, Henry," she said, wiping her eyes. "You are home. You've just got the worst possible commute to admit it." The thing they hadn't named sat between him and Elena like a held breath, and it was Elena, in the end, who let it out, because she had decided during the reckoning that she was done being a woman who staked everything on the truth in public and hid from it in private. She found him in the small quiet gallery where the walls barely sang, where it had all started turning, and she did not sit, and she did not fence. "I have run out of graceful ways again," she said. "So I will simply say it badly. When you were in the resonance ring, and the note went ragged, and I thought I was watching you die for a law of my people. In that moment I did not think there goes my witness. I thought there goes the only person who ever made this house feel warm." Her chin lifted the way it did before something that cost her. "I am a queen. I am allowed to command armies and rewrite law and stake my throne on a cord. I have never once been told I am allowed to want a thing for myself. So I am telling myself, Henry, I want this. I want you. I would like, very much, for you to stop pretending you're about to fix your landing gear and leave." Henry, who narrated his own life, who had a remark for every occasion, looked at the pale face and the silver line on her ear and the thing in her eyes that had stopped pretending years of feeling ago, and he found that all his remarks had gone somewhere else. "I've been a courier 11 years, he said finally, low. "You know what a courier is. A man who carries something precious to where it belongs and then leaves. That's the whole job. Carry it, hand it over, fly home." He crossed the small distance between them. "I got it wrong exactly once. I picked up something precious over a crater field on a boring run, and I have spent every day since trying to figure out where to hand it over so I could fly home, and it turns out the answer is I can't. There's nowhere to hand you over to, Elena. I checked. I'd have to keep you." He took her hands, both of them. "So if you're done being told what you're allowed to want, I'm done being a man who leaves." That's the whole speech. It's not graceful either. We're terrible at this. "We are catastrophic at this," Elena agreed, and kissed him, in the gallery where the walls barely sang, and the walls sang anyway. The air came in the deep of a Denar winter, in a room full of frightened healers who need not have been frightened, because this child had already survived a burning transport and a reckoning, and had clearly decided that being born was well within her abilities. A daughter. The last heir of the line, and now, impossibly, the first of something new. Elena held her and wept the good kind of tears, and Henry stood beside them in a coat that fit and understood, at last and all at once, what he'd actually done over the crater fields of Denar. He'd thought he had saved a queen. He'd told it that way at first. A good story for the bar, a queen and a blanket and a bad back. Then he'd learned he had saved two, and thought that was the whole of it, the enormous thing, the debt too large to name. But standing there with the small, furious child gripping his finger with a strength that surprised him, the way her mother had gripped his sleeve in the fire, he saw the real size of it for the first time. He hadn't saved a life, or 2 lives, or a bloodline. He'd saved a family. And then, in the slow, catastrophic way of a man who is bad at plans and good at showing up, he had gone and become part of it. They named her Ava, which was not a royal name, which was the point. And years later, when Ava was old enough to be told stories and stubborn enough to demand them, it was always the same one she wanted, told by a father who left out the part where he'd cried on the way home and put it back in when she was old enough to understand why a person might. There's a particular kind of silence, Henry would begin every time, with Elena listening from the doorway and pretending she wasn't. That happens right before everything goes wrong. And I want you to know, the manifest said boring. He'd lean in. It was the best thing I ever read wrong in my life. Henry spent 11 years being a courier, believing his job was to carry precious things to where they belonged, and then leave. And maybe that's what most of us believe our lives are. A series of deliveries, of showing up, doing the thing, and moving on. He thought he'd saved a queen. Then he learned he'd saved 2 lives. But the truth was larger than any of them counted, because he hadn't just pulled someone from a fire. He'd walked into a story he assumed had nothing to do with him, and stayed long enough to become its heart. So here's what lingers, once the crystal court goes quiet. How many times have you done something small, a moment of showing up, a choice not to look away, and never learned what it truly became in someone else's life? How often is the real weight of what we do hidden from us, unfolding in rooms we'll never enter? Henry read boring on a manifest, and it was wrong every single day. Maybe the ordinary runs we're all flying through are wrong too, quietly, generously wrong, carrying more meaning than we ever stop to read. The question the story leaves you holding is a gentle one. Somewhere out there is a fire you pulled someone from without knowing it. And somewhere someone is telling a story about you, the stranger who showed up, who couldn't leave, who saved more than they'll ever know. What will yours turn out to have been? Our story ends here, friends. Don't forget to like the story, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Travelers so you don't miss the next story. Take care until the next story.